Action, excitement,
horror, romance,
thrills and chills,
swords and sorcery,
rockets and ray guns, a dizzying panoply of the strange and impossible from the darkest depths of the human imagination. What mad universe encompasses such tales as these? Join us as we bear witness to the sweeping sprawl of all the history that never was and all the futures that could yet be. It's adventure as you like it on What Mad Universe?
Once upon a time, back in the days between the Great World Wars, there was a humble professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford College. His name was John Ronald Rural Tolkien, for people were richly endowed with names back in those days. We know him today as J.R.R. Tolkien, in the vulgar, author of The Hobbit, The Silmarillion, and of course The Lord of the Rings. But back in the 1930s, he was a college lecturer known mostly for a paper he'd written on Beowulf. While marking papers one day, he was seized by inspiration and wrote the words, "In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit." And a cultural phenomenon was born. But The Hobbit was only one story Tolkien wrote during this period. His publisher, Stanley Unwin, passed many of these stories he told to his children on to his son Rayner, who enthusiastically endorsed them, and encouraged Tolkien to work them into a collection of faux medieval fairy tales. If his interest had only gone in a slightly different direction, would Peter Jackson have instead directed a 3-movie epic adaptation of Farmer Giles of Ham? Hi, I'm Philip Rice, and with me always is Adam Prosser.
Hello.
And this is What Mad Universe. Today, as we've done before, we're looking at a more obscure work by a well-known author. The writer is J.R.R. Tolkien, and the book is Farmer Giles of Ham. Originally told as a fairy tale to his children, Tolkien proceeded to polish it and gave it a more scholarly sheen. And it was eventually published with illustrations in 1949.
Yes, it was a book that he wrote kind of concurrently with The Hobbit, which is the interesting thing for me. What was it, Phil? So this was one of Phil's suggestions this week. And you said you read this as a kid, or you?
I read this in 2001. I was getting into Tolkien because the movie was about to come out. Mm-hmm. And I read The Hobbit and I read Lord of the Rings. And I couldn't make it through the Silmarillion. I think I was too young for that at 13. So yeah. I still have never revisited it. So I want to do that someday. But yeah.
It's interesting. When I was a kid, I had trouble with Lord of the Rings. I was about that age. I was a little younger.
It took me a while to get through it.
But I actually really got into the Silmarillion. I think I was around 13, 14. Maybe I was a little older. But I got into it pretty hard because the thing is, it's the most mythological one he's done, the most explicitly like old school mythology, that spoke to me anyway. I really liked it personally.
Anyway, so I picked up a bunch of books in a big splurge, and this is one of the only ones I actually read. But
right. Of Tolkien specifically, or
yeah,
just
of
in
Tolkien's.
General? Yeah.
I got his Forgotten Tales. Was that it?
Right. Yeah.
And some other.
There's the Book of Lost Tales.
Lost Tales. That was it.
Yeah. There's these other ones he did, like Leaf by Niggle or something like that.
No, I never read that one. Or his Santa Claus biography.
There's the Santa Claus biography that he did.
Or the one on the dog, Rover Random.
Right.
Which seems similar to this one.
It's funny, the one he did about Santa Claus sounds a lot like the stop-motion animated movie they did, Santa Claus's Life and Times.
Wasn't that based on the Frank L. Baum story?
Oh, okay. All right. Fair enough.
It might have been. I don't know. But he also wrote a biography
I think you're
of Santa
right.
Claus.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. I guess around that Frank L. Baum's a little bit earlier than Tolkien, just a little bit. But I guess people like doing epic fantasy versions of Santa Claus back in those days.
Grant Morrison's doing one.
Yeah. Well, he's got that going on as well.
Yeah, something something I thought was interesting. Tolkien had an interest in dragons from a young age, obviously, because the first story he ever wrote, he was 7 years old, and he showed it to his mother, very proud of it, and it was about a green great dragon, and his mother scolded him lightly, not like punished him, but said it should be great green dragon, because that's how English works. It's an unspoken rule that... and I read an article about why that is. I can't remember. But there's an order for...
exactly.
But Tolkien was sort of dismayed by this and didn't write again for years. But luckily for fantasy literature in general, he ended up picking it up again.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and he seemed to like his dragons, because there's a dragon in The Hobbit, there's there's dragons in the Silmarillion, there's dragons in this thing, and that's just the staple of medieval literature.
But they are cool.
They are very cool.
Yeah, so this is, it's not explicitly a children's book, though it was originally made as a story to tell for his children, like literally a bedtime story.
Yeah.
Supposedly,
the story I heard was that they were out at a picnic and it started pouring rain, so they had to go under a tree and wait for a while. Yeah. And that's in the foreword, I think. Yeah. And so he made up that story to keep them entertained while they were waiting.
But
for the
expanded
rain.
on it over the years.
Right.
Like this would have been in the 20s probably.
Yeah.
That he first came up with it.
As I understand, he wrote it sort of as a kid's book. He was sort of floating it to the publisher, but it was just a little short story.
Yeah, I actually the edition that I have that I got as a teenager was actually includes the original draft, and I read that over actually just today.
Yeah.
It's only 24 pages. So it's about half the length of the regular story if you count the illustrations.
Yeah. The original plan, I think, was when he went to Unwin, they liked it. He basically said, write 3 or 4 more of these, and we'll collect it into one book, and they'll all be kind of linked together. And
the
Tales
idea
of the
they
Middle
would
Kingdom.
be set in the same Middle Kingdom tale.
Right.
Yeah, Tales of the Middle Kingdom, which is the setting, but it's explicitly in England, unlike Lord of the Rings.
Right. It's set in basically faux medieval. It's supposed to be set in the period just before King Arthur, I believe.
No, it's between the reigns of King Cole and King Arthur, which would put it in the.
Is that the old King Cole of the stories? Really?
Yeah.
Is that where that comes from?
Yeah, it seems to be. I didn't really look much into it, but it is that. It's
spelled how's it spelled? Coel.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
And it got changed, obviously, over the years, as things do, because, 5th century,
Yeah.
Or I guess it would be 3rd century, I don't know.
They said, I think, it's a little vague, but I think they said 3rd century for Cole and pegging Arthur as 6th century, although
late
he's
5th,
basically...
early 6th, yeah.
But Arthur's basically fantastical,
so
they're
it's kind of hard to... Yeah.
It's kind of hard to pin down
All
exactly.
this comes from Joffrey of Monmouth, who was, quote, historian, who just made up a lot of stuff.
Right.
But he was a big influence on Arthur, subsequent Arthur stories. Joffrey of Monmouth came up with the idea that Britain was founded by a Roman citizen named Brutus.
Yes.
Who arrived on the island and slayed all the giants who were living there.
Yes.
And named it after himself, so Brutus Britain. It's completely made up.
Yeah. That's right.
This isn't Brutus from the Caesar thing. Different Brutus. It was a common name, but yeah.
Well, it would have had to be. Oh, I guess technically it could have been around the same time because Caesar did
different
conquer
guy.
Britain. But I know it's not.
He was supposedly the great grandson or grandson, something like that, of Aenid from the.
Right.
Aenus from the Aeneid.
Yeah, well, the Aeneid is... The Aeneid's linked to some interesting stuff because that's also the idea that they founded... Because Aenus was basically the founder of Rome, or the great-great-great-great-grandfather of Romulus and Remus who founded Rome, and that Rome was... Like, I think it's been argued that...
it was definitely a pro-Roman propaganda.
Right, but specifically the argument was that it was written to justify Rome's invasion of Greece as saying, like, we're revenge for the Trojan War, basically.
I think so. I'm not sure if that was a specific cause, but it was definitely written by Virgil as pro, Roman.
Right. But yeah, the thing about Brutus being the founder of Rome,
and Brutus is mentioned in the foreword. So
right.
all this is unlike Lord of the Rings, like we've said, this is set firmly in the real world, but a fantastical version of the real world.
Yeah. Well, it started. Let's sort of talk about that a bit. It started as we say, a kid's story, and he started just telling this goofy story, and he talks about, for instance, a blunderbuss early on.
Yeah.
That's
a type of gun that was invented in the 1600s.
Right. That's exactly. It's anachronistic, and those are the kinds of guns where it would be the big wide muscle gun where you just load it with whatever garbage you had, and
it specifically
put in
says
black
bits
powder.
of chain and bits of pottery and
right. And he even says in the book, and it would sometimes hit its target.
Yeah.
It's completely useless. But then he started to lock it down a little more, and it's funny because Tolkien was very notable in the other books for really trying to nail down historical discrepancies, even though he was creating a fantasy world. Mm-hmm. He actually went back and rewrote The Hobbit. Of course, Hobbit was rewritten famously to tie it more with Lord of the Rings, but for instance, he took out in the original version of The Hobbit, there's a talk about tomatoes, I believe, which are, of course, a New World crop, so they wouldn't have existed in Middle Earth, which is still supposed to be like
Neither
England.
would tobacco, Tolkien.
But you could argue that wasn't real tobacco anyway.
Yeah, it's pipeweed,
yeah.
But tomatoes, I did know that story, and I found it funny because tomatoes are explicitly mentioned in the Fellowship of the Ring movie.
Right, are they?
They're cooking tomatoes at one point on the fire.
Well, because that's a very English breakfast thing to eat. It makes sense.
Yeah, but I don't know if that was an intentional nod to that or if it was just them,
right?
Just adding stuff because the movies added stuff.
Yeah, because it is in the original draft. It's just
of The Hobbit.
That he changed it later, and of course the original draft of The Hobbit is the more notable change is that in the original version he beats Gollum at the riddle game, and Gollum just agrees to let him out, and they part, and there's not a big fight or anything. That actually gets through, and then in the foreword to Lord of the Rings, Tolkien describes that as. That was the original story Bilbo told Gandalf until he pushed him on it, and then he realized that he'd lied and actually he'd sort of run off, and that was an early sign that the ring was corrupting his mind, basically. Mm-hmm. But it was literally the earlier draft of The Hobbit that he'd gone in and rewritten. Yeah. So that's how he explained it. It's like
it should also know, and most people know this, but The Hobbit wasn't originally meant to be set in Middle-earth. Mm-hmm. It was originally just a standalone fantasy story, and as he was writing Lord of the Rings, he realized that the ring, the magic ring, which was just a magic ring, was the one ring of his Silmarillion, which he had been writing all his life, and never released until after his death.
Right.
So he realized, as he was writing Lord of the Rings, that this was a much bigger story, and that's why it took so long to come out. Actually, that's part of why Farmer Giles of Ham was published when it was, because the publisher was looking for a
Hobbit follow-up.
A follow-up to The Hobbit, and he was taking forever to write Lord of the Rings.
Right.
Which paid off.
Yeah. Well, even Farmer Giles of Ham took like a decade to write, from what I can tell.
Yeah,
because he wrote it down.
He had most of it.
From what I understand, he told it this as his quick story. He was going to write a bunch more stories. They took a while, and to be fair, World War II happened in there too, so that kind of delayed it. But he went to, I believe it's called the Lovelace Society, which was a philological or historical society of some kind. He basically told the story, which apparently had them rolling in the aisles because they're a bunch of medieval scholars, so it's a bunch of medieval scholar jokes. He expanded on it and basically presented it as if it was an old folk tale that had been passed down by someone like Jeffrey of Monmouth.
Well, the foreword was added much later, actually, just before or soon before publishing,
right?
But it was still very much written in that style.
But what I mean is, he wrote it like it was a kid's story that he was telling.
Yeah,
and he'd adapted it to be like for a bunch of scholars, as if, well, here's a story I dug up, and here's the version I'm telling. Basically, well, and it adds all these scholarly jokes and this kind of meta framework for it, which is in the final book, basically.
Yeah, it's in the book in the foreword, which, like I said,
well, not just the foreword, but the book itself is written almost as if it wasn't written straight up as a kid's book at that point. It is, but it's got a sense of like knowing scholar, as they point out in the foreword. In the earlier version, it was like well, if it was being told familiarly as if it was being told by him to his kids, and he refers to himself as daddy and stuff in the stories, whereas this is a bit more of a, here's like a scholar writing down a folktale is kind of the approach he's taking.
And that's similar to what he would take with the idea that The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings are translations of an ancient text that was passed on through the Red Book of Westmarch.
Right. Yeah, there's all these weird rules in The Hobbit. Like, he says the original pronunciation of Hobbit is Holbitla, which means hole builder. And, like, he's got all this architectural, linguistic stuff going on with all the characters.
But as I was saying earlier, The Hobbit wasn't originally set in the same setting as the Silmarillion. Mm-hmm. Actually, early drafts, not ones that were released, like the one with the different riddle contests, but early drafts of The Hobbit actually mentioned China.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there's the only remaining bit of it is describing the wereworms, which he describes as like a faraway thing.
Right.
But in the original thing, it says the wireworms of China, which is probably a reference to the Mongolian death worms.
Interesting.
And of course, the wereworms became giant weird worms in the Hobbit movie, but anyway.
Right. Well, it's interesting in the even in the published version of Lord of the Rings, he mentions like as a simile, but he talks about a railroad. It blasted through, or like a locomotive or something like that.
Okay, I don't remember that. But yeah.
And I mean, it's not any of the characters in the story saying that. It is the authorial comment, but it still doesn't quite fit, because if it's supposed to be a translation of the Red Book of Redmarch, written, I believe, by Frodo himself, was the rationale for Lord of the Rings.
And ended by Sam, who wrote the last bit.
Right. And because Frodo was gone by that point. But yeah, so strictly speaking, that doesn't quite add up, and he was actually pretty meticulous about going back and fixing that stuff. But you can really tell with the first, like, half of the first book of Lord of the Rings that he had not intended to write it. It was just a kid's book sequel to The Hobbit, and then it switches gears and becomes a real sequel.
And he didn't have the heart to remove some things. Like Tom Bombadil probably would have, like, I don't mind Tom Bombadil, but he doesn't fit in this story.
Right. Yeah,
he's more of like, he should have gone into a different book.
Right. Yeah. He definitely sticks out as being someone who belonged in The Hobbit and not, Lord of the Rings, basically.
And I mean, that's the, like, any even purists who say that you should have adapted Tolkien slavishly don't say you should include Tom Bombadil.
Well, it's like a lot of, and I mean, as with the movie when they did the Scouring of the Shire, they had all this problem with getting everything in, even though the Scouring of the Shire, a lot of people would argue, is one of the most crucial aspects of the book. But it's all falling action at that point, because they've already saved the world and everything. So it is a very difficult, that's one of the reasons a lot of people said Lord of the Rings can never be adapted, because you've got, a good half hour of stuff that happens after the supposed climax of the story. But of course, that is crucial to the theme and everything that he was saying in the story. The idea that you go home and it's changed after you come back from a war, basically. So he, and of course he was never writing, of course movies existed, but he was never writing it in sort of the cinematic way that we're used to. He was still in the first generation of people who'd seen a movie, basically.
I recall, this is where we should get back to the book soon, but I recall that there was, he reviewed a screenplay for an adaptation of Lord of the Rings, and he complained about them using eagles as taxis, and everybody was eating ridiculously long sandwiches.
Okay.
That's a very strange detail, and it's not elaborated on that, but that was a big thing in fandom when I was getting into it. There was just jokes about ridiculously long sandwiches.
I think I remember that. Yes, that was a big weird obsession. And he also had a big moment where he very firmly said, "I never want Walt Disney to adapt this," basically, because he like as an animated movie is how he was thinking, because he said he'd make it too cutesy, basically, that he was too, quote, vulgar. My favorite idea of earlier trying to adapt Lord of the Rings before it actually happened was the idea that they were apparently going to get the Beatles to be in Lord of the Rings.
Oh, I remember that, yeah.
With, I think, John as Gandalf, George as Strider, Paul as Frodo and Ringo as Sam would have been the cast if they'd done that.
That would have been so weird.
It would have been I would have been amazing, but it definitely would have deviated from the book pretty heavily. It would have been more like, I mean, they basically made Yellow Submarine, although that's a different. It didn't become Yellow Submarine by any means. And of course, John Boorman, who did Excalibur, that did start out as actually an adaptation of Lord of the Rings. Yeah, he said, he basically said I wanted Lord of the Rings. He realized, again, there's all these problems with adapting it, plus you've basically got to make 3 movies. So he basically said, well, I'll do Excalibur, and I'll do King Arthur instead. And he
That's sort of like George Lucas not being able to get the rights to Flash Gordon, so making Star Wars.
Right.
That's one version of how it happened.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Anyway, Farmer Giles of Ham.
Yeah, so tell us, let's summarize the story. Phil, if you want to summarize Farmer Giles of Ham.
Okay, well, it's fairly simple. It starts off with a giant whose his name has been lost to history. He loses his way and wanders into the populated areas, and he wanders into Farmer Giles's region, and Giles's dog Garm, named after the most of the characters in the book have Latin names because England was still Latin at the time.
Can I say Farmer Giles's full name?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So he's listed. His name is strictly listed as Aegidius Ahenobarbus Julius Agricola de Hamo.
Mm-hmm. And they're all apparently references to farmers and things.
Yeah. It means Giles the red-bearded something farmer of Ham, basically. Mm-hmm. So. Yeah.
So his dog is actually named after a Norse legend about a it's the dog that guards the underworld, basically.
Oh, okay.
Guards hell.
Right. Cerberus is the dog that... Oh, in Norse mythology.
Yeah, Norse mythology.
Okay, right.
Yeah. It means howler or something like that.
Okay.
Anyway, so the dog runs to Giles asking for help. The dog can talk. Because it says dogs could talk in those days.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Gary Larson cartoon about the guy who built a translation helmet for dogs, and the dogs are all running around going, "Hey, hey, 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 hey!"
There's also
That's about as useful as Garm is in this story.
There's also a Dexter's Lab episode where Dexter gets annoyed that he adopts a dog, and it keeps barking at him. Mm-hmm. So he builds technology to get the dog to talk, but the dog just says, "Hey, look at the thing! Look at the thing!"
Right, exactly. Squirrel. Yeah.
Anyway, so Garm, who says "help, help" all the time, mm-hmm. Goes to Giles and says there's a giant and he's going to, go on his property. So Giles gets out his blunderbuss and, he's not like a brave guy.
Right.
He gets braver as the story goes on, but he's more like Bilbo. He's at the start of the story. He's a very Bilbo-ish character I picked up.
Yeah, I think he's a bit grumpier than Bilbo, I would say.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And a little, like, Bilbo's a fundamentally good, heroic person. He's a little guy who's never been tested, essentially.
Okay, well, I mean Bilbo at the start of The Hobbit.
Right, yeah. No, he's not, he's an unlikely hero, for sure.
Yeah, yeah. And he's a rustic, chubby guy, so it just reminded me. Anyway, So Giles ends up shooting the giant in the face with his blunderbuss and makes him fall flat on his back. But the giant gets a nail caught in his nose and thinks he's been stung by a horsefly and wanders off. And everybody in the town that Garm had alerted think that Giles actually managed to scare off the giant. The giant didn't know that there were even people there, but anyway. So Giles becomes a local hero, and at the same time, the giant who has returned home starts telling everybody about this wide open area with no people, no knights to kill people, to kill monsters, and plenty of cattle and things. So a dragon named, can you pronounce the name?
Chrysophyrax.
Okay,
I believe is the pronunciation.
Yeah, so Chrysophyrax,
which means guardian of gold, by the way, in Greek.
Yeah. And he also has the subtitle Dios, which means the rich.
Right. Tolkien was a linguist, so
yeah.
he dwelled on all this stuff a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. Even in his Lord of the Rings type
Right.
stuff where he invented his own language. It was still there's lots of linguist jokes in this.
Well, this is what I'm saying, where it feels like it was a scholarly retread
Yeah.
of a fairy tale. Anyway,
yeah.
go on.
So Giles is pressured into. He also had been sent a sword by the king as congratulations for scaring off a giant. The sword, as it turns out, was a magical sword that belonged to a dragon slayer hundreds of years ago. And
The sword is called
I can't pronounce the sword's name,
Caudemordax,
which means tailbiter. Yeah,
right.
which we'll call it tailbiter. And tailbiter is an enchanted sword, somewhat like Sting. It warns of a specific threat that's coming. Sting warns of orcs, but tailbiter leaps out of its scabbard when a dragon is within 5 miles.
Right.
And in earlier drafts, it was 100 miles, which would be useless because, and,
Anywhere there's a
and
dragon.
then it was changed to 2 miles, which would also be useless because the dragon could just sneak,
Yeah, would be almost on
yeah.
top of you, basically.
So, happy medium. So Giles is pressured into by the village because of his heroic reputation and his sword to go slay the dragon. So they put together a bad armor for him, hastily made armor made out of just mail stitched into a leather jerkin and other pieces of metal. In the first draft that I read, it was actual chains. So it was literally chainmail. I wish he kept that, actually, because that's kind of funny.
Mm-hmm.
So it turns out that the sword was able to do most of the work. So he managed to threaten the dragon into traveling to town. And the dragon promised that if they let him live, he would give them all his money, because dragon horde and all that.
Mm-hmm.
But he lied because he's a dragon.
Right.
And they foolishly allowed him to fly off.
Yeah. Well, they said we place solemn oaths upon you to come back, and he has to swear up and down that he's
He also he offered half price for children, which was a pun on the idea of admittance for theater or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But in this case, he's literally giving half price for every child he killed. So like a price for every man he killed and half price for every child.
Right.
So that's a little dark.
Yeah.
So anyway, the dragon flies off, and the king arrives in town and, expects the money and wants to tax it to hell because he insists that it was probably stolen from his ancestors.
Right. The king's kind of slavering the whole time about all the money he's going to get from this.
Yeah.
Basically.
So eventually...
And they talk about the king being broke, too, basically.
Yeah.
He just was wasted his money, basically.
Do you have the king's name written down?
It is King Augustus Bonifacius.
Yeah, and he has
Rex et Tyrannus.
Yeah, he has a bunch of names that are all very unflattering, apparently, if you read the original languages.
What means king and tyrant, basically.
Yeah, but he's got a bunch of other names that are all just sort of apparently have bad connotations, like are, on the surface complimentary, but apparently have bad connotations. So it's more linguist jokes.
Yeah, this is what the Lovelace Society thought was so hilarious, basically.
The king ends up recruiting Giles along with all his knights to go after the dragon, but as they're arriving, the dragon hears them coming because they're singing songs, and Giles' horse, his gray mare, actually lags behind, which ends up saving his life because the dragon kills most of the knights and the rest run off. But Giles manages to take advantage of the sword, which once again, the sword, unlike Sting, is actually sort of fights for you if there's a dragon involved. So like it does. I think it describes it as doing its best in unskilled hands. That was it. So Giles ends up stopping the dragon, and this time ends up actually strapping all the dragon's treasure to its back and puts it into town, drives it into town.
Yeah, they have a whole negotiation, basically. The dragon comes off as kind of a penny pincher, basically.
Yeah.
And he's talking about, this'll this'll bankrupt me. It's
Yeah,
like, you're a
but
dragon. What are you spending it on?
Well, they like to keep it.
I know that's the whole point of it. Yeah.
But Giles actually lets the dragon keep a little bit, which the narration says was good because most knights would have taken all of it, and then there would be a curse on it.
Right.
Dragon curse, which once again happens in The Hobbit, though that's standard in since the ring cycle. So
right. I'm actually, I mean, it seems to me the dragon could have put a curse on it anyway, but
he was grateful.
I guess he was. Yeah. There you go.
Because he got to keep some of it.
Yeah.
Anyway, so and the dragon actually helps Guile defend his land against the king coming in to take all it away again.
Right.
And the dragon actually stands along with Giles and stops the knights from attacking and all that. So Guile, what? Sorry?
It sort of becomes like Davy Crockett and the bear almost.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that.
Supposedly Davy Crockett stared down a bear, and the bear
killed him a bear when
no, didn't kill him a bear. He's well, it depends on the version, but
killed him a bar when he was only 3.
Is that how it goes?
That's
I don't
a
know.
song.
I thought it was that he stared down the bear, and the bear ended up becoming his pet, basically.
It probably got exaggerated.
Well, no, none of this actually happened, obviously.
I mean, it probably got further exaggerated.
Yeah.
Into the song version.
Yeah.
So Giles ends up becoming not only a local hero, but he gets a title and eventually becomes king of the area, and his family becomes the Wormings because worm dragon, and eventually Ham becomes Worming Hall, which is still the name.
Apparently, that's a real place. In England.
Yeah. It's so this is a name origin sort of thing, but a fake,
Yeah. Fake story about
Yeah.
Well, doesn't he also say something about Ham becomes the Thames or something?
Yeah. No, it's because of the tame dragon.
Right.
So tame becomes Thames.
Yeah.
Or Tem.
Yeah.
Thames is elsewhere, but it's similar name.
Oh, it's not actually the same as the River Thames?
I think it's related.
Oh, okay. All right.
That's Thames.
Yeah.
That's with an S. So
right.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but this is all the mutation of language. Anyway,
Yeah.
So,
But they're related. Yeah. Tem and Thames are related, but different.
Okay, cool.
To my knowledge. I'm not English, obviously.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of weird linguistic quirks in English, in the British version of English language.
Anyway, so Giles lives happily ever after, basically.
Yes.
And there was a sequel plan there's 4 pages written of it. It was included in my edition as well.
It's about his son, right?
Yeah, it's about his son who's named Georgie, probably a reference to St. George, famously, killed the last dragon in England. And this story also, I guess we could talk about literary connections to other stories that might have inspired it. It's possibly inspired, at least in part, by The Reluctant Dragon. By
Kenneth Grahame, yeah.
Kenneth Grahame.
He wrote The Wind and the Willows, too.
Oh, okay.
But
I didn't connect that. But I read it yesterday.
Right.
The Reluctant Dragon.
How does that one go again? How's that?
Well, it's about a friendly dragon who just wants to do poetry.
Right.
And a kid who befriends him. And then, but everybody in town starts spreading rumors about it, so St. George comes into town.
Okay.
And they eventually form an agreement where they'll do a fake fight in front of everybody and pretend to tame the dragon.
Right.
But it ends with everybody, being friends, basically.
Yeah. That's right. I mean, I've definitely read it, but it was a long time ago.
But the original St. George story involves St. George driving the dragon into town, taming it, and then cutting off its head. So that is also... So it's more related probably to the original St. George story than necessarily the Reluctant Dragon.
Yeah.
But there's definitely connections there.
Well, I mean, it was clearly around that time people were doing the whole...
Yeah.
And this story is very clearly written, like it's, purporting to be a medieval folktale, but it's very clearly written in the Victorian or Edwardian style of like a fairy tale for kids, right? It's kind of... cutesy and knowing and it doesn't have the voice of an actual folktale, basically.
No, not really.
And it's it's trying to be kind of witty. Well, it is. It's a witty version of it.
It also reminded me, at least in part, of a Lord Dunsany story, as things often do, called The Tower of the Gibelins, which is mostly not about this, but it involves a small part where the knight character goes to a dragon and threatens him, and saying that knights always prevail in tales, so the dragon becomes afraid because they're in a tale.
Right. Okay.
So it's meta in that way. But the knight gets the dragon to fly him across the forest impassable.
Okay. Well, and then the one I thought it wasn't specifically mentioned by any of the materials I saw, but it really reminds me of the story of the Brave Little Tailor, if you're familiar with that one, which is it's one of the Brothers Grimm story. So it's a German story, that means. And in that's the version where a tailor's sitting just I think waiting for a pie to cool or something, and so he sees some flies buzzing around and he swats them and he gets 7 all at once, and he's kind of a fool, he's very egotistical, so he's so proud of himself he makes a belt that says 7 at one blow because of how proud he is. And so that spins out into a story about this guy who got 7 and everyone thinks he means humans, right? And then he ends up being sent to kill a giant, and he basically keeps impressing the giant. He's sort of smart enough to, like, for instance, the giant is able to grab a stone and squeeze a drop of water out of it, and he takes a cheese and squeezes it until the whey comes out, so that the giant thinks he's way stronger than him. All that kind of stuff. But it's the classic sort of he bluffs his way through life and keeps getting good things happen to him, basically. And it had a lot of the same elements of that as this, basically, where he's a he kind of keeps prevailing by being really lucky, not actually having any skill or anything. So
Giles is definitely very lucky, though he does get brave at points, but mostly it's through the fact that he keeps winning, so he gets confident.
Well, like I said, the Brave Little Tailor. It's about how he's brave with nothing to back it up, basically. But he's brave enough that it works out. So,
but there's a bit. This is kind of another tangent about the book, but there's a bit where what's the position? Pastor? No, he's not a pastor. Parson. Thank you.
Yeah.
I keep wanting to say priest because he would be Catholic because it's before the Reformation, but.
Well, it's the town priest.
Yeah, the parson.
Well, hang on. I'm not familiar with this. Are priests only Catholic? I thought you could have a
there are other priests in other religions, but it just I thought that a Catholic. I don't know. I can't remember.
Yeah,
it's been a while since I've been religious, and I was barely religious anyway. So the parson is described as a man of letters, is described as having foresight, and suggests to Giles that he should bring a rope when he goes to confront the dragon, because and that comes in handy because he ropes the treasure to his back. But that's probably a joke about, as a man of letters, he can see into the future, and that's amusing to Tolkien because he was a translator himself.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's like the joke about, at one point he talks about the learned clerks of Oxford, which is just a reference to the Oxford Dictionary, which is where apparently Tolkien worked initially after World War I. He literally got his first job working for the Oxford English Dictionary, which is kind of cool. He really did come up from not much, from what I can tell. He didn't actually have any real he didn't have any family connections or anything, which were a big deal in England at the time, and he got sort of pushed into going off into World War I. I was reading the story. I mean, slight tangent, but I was actually reading this. There's a movie out right now about Tolkien and his.
Oh, I was wondering
life.
when we get to that.
Yeah, and I haven't seen the movie, but from what I was reading about his life, it was he basically he met a girl. He was raised by a priest after his parents died, and he said he learned a lot from him, and that made him very religious because he was Catholic, and he was. He met this girl who he fell madly in love with, Edith. Edith Tolkien eventually, and the priest basically said it's not right for you to be courting a girl before you're of age, so you have to break it off and never talk to her until you become of age, basically. So he wasn't allowed to even like write to her and say why he broke it off. So they waited, a couple years till he turned 18 or 19. Then he wrote back. Then he tracked her down, and she was actually engaged at that point. And he said, and she said, I thought you just didn't like me anymore. You ran off. He's like, no, the priest said I could not talk to you until I was of age. So then she was like, oh, well, that changes everything. She broke off her engagement, which got everyone angry. And the thing is, he was just nobody. They were engaged to someone, she was engaged to someone with, some prospects, basically, and he didn't have any prospects. So so obviously they were very much in love. So they got married, and then almost immediately Tolkien had to go off to World War One. So that was like, well, you could have just dumped this guy, and then he could have died in World War One, and you would have been out of luck. But of course, he made it through World War One, and that was, people always compare tie Lord of the Rings to World War Two, but Tolkien himself was pretty adamant that's like, no, it was my experience in World War One more than anything that really shaped it.
And he also said it wasn't an allegory for anything.
No,
because he didn't like allegories. So.
Yeah, he was very loud about that. But I mean, you can see that, like the spirit of war and lingering doom and all that. Like, obviously, this was something that was written around the time of the World War One and World War Two.
Oh yeah, definitely. And say the scene where Frodo and Sam are sort of conscripted into the orc army by accident.
Right.
The orcs are calling them maggot and
yeah. He said he really felt because he had a very kind of lofty upper class attitude in some ways, even though he wasn't really upper class from what I can tell. But he said, I saw a lot of supposed gentlemen not acting like gentlemen, and I saw a lot of regular folks who good, decent people. Yeah, that he said whenever the orcs are talking, it's probably like soldiers talk he picked up in World War One, basically. So
yeah, the Hobbit movies have a lot of problems, but I got the DVDs anyway, or the Blu-rays anyway, because mostly for the concept art and stuff from my perspective, because I really like that stuff. But on one of the documentaries, one of the Tolkien scholars that they have on those things was talking about how Smaug was sort of meant to be a reclamation of the old medieval-style dragon, that it's sort of... because in the Victorian times, most dragon stories were like the reluctant dragon, where it was sort of subverting that, but Tolkien wanted to go back to the old style, actually threatening dragon. And it's interesting in that light that Tolkien actually wrote one of the sort of non-threatening dragon. Like he kills people. Like this dragon, unlike the one in the Reluctant Dragon, is murderous, but he ends up being tame and kind of cowardly, and well,
he's comical. The whole book is written very whimsically, and it's not the dragon in a weird way. I mean, he's threat, but the joke is that this guy who doesn't know what he's doing beats the dragon, basically. And like I say, the dragon's written as kind of like a banker or something almost, who cares about.
Oh yeah, there's a bit about I can't remember the exact terminology, but it was modern terms about how he was expecting interest paid or something.
Yeah, he talks about interest, and he talks about So it's as you say, I think it was the sense that Victorians had a somewhat detached attitude towards fairy tales and so on. There's a book called, there's a series of books called The Blue Fairy Book, The Yellow Fairy Book, by I believe Stephen Lang is the guy's name, and it was a collection of old stories, but they're told in that Victorian style, which is kind of I don't want to say tongue-in-cheek, but it's almost done like knowingly. It's not. It's less, compared to say the Brothers Grimm, which is very straightforward, sincere telling of the story. It's told with a bit of or if you read something like Peter Pan, it's got that kind of whimsy to it. But yeah, as you say, Smaug goes back to
even though it's a children's book, it's still he's very much a threat, and he's not ever treated as a joke.
Well, you can see that evolution throughout Tolkien's work, because he's writing the Hobbit, and like I say, he's writing Farmer Giles of Ham and the Hobbit at the same time, and they're both very kid-friendly book, but the Hobbit gets those darker and more serious notes. Even in the Hobbit as it goes, it gets darker and more serious. like Beowulf, like Gollum was always inspired by Grendel and Beowulf to a large degree, and he was of course an expert on Beowulf, Tolkien, and you can just see it kind of getting like, you know, he's the Hobbit. The point of the Hobbit, especially in Lord of the Rings, is that the hobbits are like kids' story characters who find themselves in a much darker and more serious adult mythological world. He even ended up saying, like, when he decided not to publish the Silmarillion because, you know, he felt like if there weren't any hobbits, it would be harder to relate to it, because the hobbits are the everymen in this much more. And it's very notable, even in Lord of the Rings, that the hobbits talk like basically contemporaneous people, whereas, you know, even the humans like Strider don't. They talk more like they're from King Arthur or from some kind of legendary.
They don't use these and thous usually. Some of them do, but
no. But they're still written as a bit more remote and less human than the hobbits. Ironically, since they're human and the hobbits aren't.
Yeah,
but that's exactly what they're supposed to represent. Of course,
definitely supposed to be audience viewpoint characters.
Right. They're supposed to represent the, you know, the triumph of the humble, vulgar, regular, every person against the backdrop of heroes and
and
godlike
Farmer
entities.
Giles as a book sort of has that.
Yeah, exactly.
But I feel it's a little more detached. It's less. It feels farther away from the subject matter than The Hobbit does.
Well, because it's because of the comedic element. It's like Hobbit at the end of the day isn't comedic. There's some funny parts, but it takes Bilbo seriously. It takes the adventure seriously. This is more like, you know, someone, like I say, it's a joking retelling of a quote real medieval story, even though it isn't. So it's got that. It's going to have that detachment to it essentially.
Yeah. But I would like to see this as like I half would and half wouldn't like to see this adapted into an animated movie or something.
Yeah.
Like, I'm worried that they would make it too much like what they did with the Hobbit movies with, you know...
a three-book
Well,
series.
maybe not, like, stretch it out that much, but, like, try to tie it into Lord of the Rings stuff too much or play up that element. Yeah. But I think that, like, as is, it would make, like, a good, like, little children's movie. I don't know.
Well, it's fascinating to me they're making a Lord of the Rings movie or series on Amazon, which is not going to be based directly on any of the books, from what I can tell.
Yeah, it's like set between the Silmarillion and the Hobbit.
Well, it's using some of the material. The Silmarillion does actually cover a lot of period. The bulk of what we call the Silmarillion is set in the First Age, but there's some other stuff later about how Sauron forged the Three Rings and stuff, and that seems to be what they're using as the basis for this story. There's lots of material there. Tolkien literally wrote so much material they ended up collecting it as, I think, a 10-book set called Morgoth's Ring, which has all his sort of revisions and ideas. And I haven't read it, but I know the Silmarillion as we know it is essentially written by his son Christopher Tolkien.
Yeah,
because he had to just pare it down and re-edit it and find which version of every story was going to fit, and so there's actually quite a lot of license taken that's maybe doesn't quite fit with what Tolkien might have potentially wanted, which is kind of interesting.
But speaking of Christopher Tolkien, who's very I don't want to say proprietary, but he's very I don't see him giving up the rights to the stuff that they don't have the rights to already.
Right. But yeah, there's all these rights issues with all the Tolkien stuff.
But I don't imagine that Farmer Giles, even if they did have the rights, would ever be adapted into anything.
Probably not. Yeah, it was.
But I'd like, you know, it would be fun.
Well, all his stuff got sort of re-released after Lord of the Rings became a success. But by that point, like the real boom for Lord of the Rings was, I believe, the late 50s, early 60s when it caught on in America. But by that point, he basically retired from writing, and he made a lot of money off it. But it was the kind of, how are we going to milk this guy for more stuff? And he didn't have that much more to do. Other than Silmarillion.
But also, Farmer Giles, you mentioned in the intro that I read, but you wrote it, that it's an interesting peek into sort of an alternate history of what, maybe this got popular instead of The Hobbit, and this is the sort of thing Tolkien focused on. Like, how would the world be different?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I doubt that would have ever been as popular with The Hobbit, but it's kind of like he focused on The Hobbit and fleshed it out into a big story instead of Farmer Giles of Ham. And it is, you can see a lot of the same themes and ideas basically that basically went into The Hobbit instead of Farmer Giles of Ham. But that is, in some ways, it's a rough draft for The Hobbit thematically.
It's still fun though.
Yeah, that's good.
And it's very short. I would recommend it definitely, especially if you're into Tolkien. But even if you're not, like it's not as ponderous as Tolkien's reputation often gives him.
Sure.
Like I don't think that's justified necessarily, but like a lot of people say Tolkien's writing is very
Yeah. Yeah, he could do... Yeah, Lord of the Rings is, again, because it's that weird straddling of kids' book and adult scholarly work, like his big nerdy thing that he had going with the Silmarillion, I actually think in some ways it's one of his more awkward books for that exact reason.
in places. Yeah,
Yeah.
It has the highest highs, but it also has some weird elements.
Well, like I say, because it was a weird fit between
Yeah.
the two things.
But this is it's just a fun little book. You can read it in a day. It's like less than a day. It's fun.
Yep.
Check it out.
That's it for What Mad Universe this week. I'm Farmer Adamilius Ahinobarbus Willius Agricola de Praso, and with me is my trusty dog Phil.
Help!
Our theme song is by Jack Feerick, the Great Dragon of the Waste, and producer Alex Ross, Rex Tyrannus et Basilius. Until next time, may you all live happily ever after.